The lights were sharp and hot overhead, burning down on the polished floor of the Senate hearing room like judgment. Cameras clicked like tiny hammers. The air was tense, heavy with anticipation, like a Mississippi summer before a thunderstorm. Everyone in the chamber could feel it. Something was coming. Senator John Neely Kennedy, his white hair brushed neatly to the side, and his tie slightly askew as if in protest of too much formality, sat still at the long desk. His fingers drummed the wood just once before stopping. His blue eyes, usually bright with humor or mischief, were now narrowed, steady, and fixed. Across from him, Senator Ted Cruz leaned forward, the corners of his mouth curled ever so slightly in that unmistakable smile he wore when he smelled blood in the water. Cruz had been preparing for this moment for days, weeks, even. A televised Judiciary Committee hearing on tech censorship had provided the perfect setup. He would come at Kennedy not with rage but with precision, with questions meant to twist, to corner, to trap. Kennedy had grown popular among Americans for his homespun wit and unflinching truth-telling. Cruz, on the other hand, was a chess player. Strategic, calculating, and frankly, a little tired of the attention Kennedy had been getting for being charming. The plan was simple: poke Kennedy, mock his folksy style, paint him as out of touch in front of the cameras. A verbal ambush disguised as debate, but Kennedy wasn't the sort of man you caught off guard. Now, before we jump into what happened that day, what Kennedy said that left Ted Cruz staring, blinking, jaw halfway open, we need to take a step back. We need to know who these men were, and why this moment mattered more than just sound bites or Senate drama. John Neely Kennedy had grown up in Zachary, Louisiana, in a house where manners mattered and your word meant everything. He was book smart, graduating from Vanderbilt, Oxford, and the University of Virginia Law. But he never let that schooling wash away his roots. He could quote Shakespeare and St. Augustine, sure, but he was just as likely to quote his mama, who used to say, "Don't buy a pig in a poke." He was quirky, genuine, and fiercely loyal to the people he represented. And while he played the part of the country lawyer with his drawl and one-liners, behind that charm was a razor-sharp legal mind. Kennedy had a rule: never speak unless you've got something worth saying, and always say it plain. Ted Cruz was another story. Born in Calgary but raised in Texas, Cruz had excelled at Princeton, then Harvard Law, where classmates remembered him as brilliant and brash. He was the debater, the guy who had to win. Driven by ambition like a horse under a whip, Cruz had built a reputation on the Hill for his intellect, his courtroom-style cross-examinations, and yes, his ability to rub even allies the wrong way. His dreams stretched far, maybe even to the Oval Office, and he didn't like distractions in his way. In recent months, as Kennedy's quotes had gone viral, lines like "They say money can't buy happiness. Look at the smile on the face of someone holding a lottery ticket," Cruz had been quietly stewing. "Kennedy's playing a game," he told a staffer. "It's an act, and I'm going to show people who's really got the brains here." Which brings us back to the hearing. The session had already seen plenty of back and forth about big tech's role in policing speech, but then Cruz shifted his line of questioning. "Senator Kennedy," he began, voice even polite, "I've noticed you tend to reduce complex issues to, let's say, bumper sticker slogans. Don't you think the American people deserve more than clever one-liners?" There was a pause. Not long, just long enough for every person in the room, and everyone watching on the live stream, to sense something had shifted. Kennedy looked up slowly, his lips curled into a soft, almost sad smile. He adjusted his glasses, then leaned toward his mic. "Well, Ted," he said, his voice smooth and low. "Just because a man talks fancy don't mean he's saying something smart. You might string $100 word onto a 10-cent thought, but that don't make it a pearl necklace." There was a beat, then an audible gasp, then laughter. Even a few staffers behind Cruz ducked their heads. But Kennedy wasn't done. "See, my mama used to tell me, don't confuse verbosity with intelligence. I try to speak in a way folks back home can understand, not to impress, but to connect. 'Cause if you can't explain it simple, maybe you don't understand it all that well yourself." Cruz blinked. His mouth opened, then shut. For once, the master of debate had nothing. He sat back in his chair, lips tight, eyes flicking away, the muscles in his jaw clenching like he'd bitten into something bitter. The hearing rolled on, but that moment lingered like smoke after a fire. That wasn't the end of it, of course. Over the next few days, the clip of Kennedy's line spread like wildfire. The internet did what it always does: memes, remixes, commentaries. But behind the scenes, both men were thinking. Cruz was furious, of course, but beneath that anger was something heavier: doubt. He'd believed he could expose Kennedy, show him as style without substance, but instead he'd been humbled. Not by brute force, but by authenticity, and that gnawed at him. Kennedy, on the other hand, wasn't celebrating. That night he went back to his office, sat quietly with a glass of sweet tea, and stared out the window. He'd embarrassed Cruz, sure, but had he gone too far? He remembered being a young man in Oxford, laughed at for his accent, called country, like it was an insult. Maybe Cruz had felt something like that in reverse. Kennedy wasn't a spiteful man. He could be sharp, but he didn't believe in cutting people just to watch them bleed. Meanwhile, there were deeper issues brewing behind the drama, real problems the hearing had surfaced. Americans were struggling to trust what they saw online: free speech, censorship, political manipulation. These weren't just Senate games. They were kitchen table worries in Nebraska and Georgia and everywhere in between. That's where the two subplots began to take shape. First was the quiet alliance forming between Kennedy and Senator Maria Sanchez, a rising Democrat from New Mexico. She was thoughtful, tech-savvy, and passionate about balancing speech protections with digital accountability. Against all odds, Kennedy and Sanchez had started talking more, not about party lines, but about solutions. Together, they drafted a bipartisan proposal to increase transparency in algorithmic content moderation. It wasn't flashy, but it was real. Second, there was Ted Cruz's quiet reckoning. A staffer, young, blunt, and honest, told him, "Sir, you're brilliant, but sometimes it's okay not to be the smartest guy in the room. Sometimes it's better to be the one who listens." That stuck. Cruz started showing up to committee meetings, not just with talking points, but with questions, real ones. Weeks later, Kennedy and Cruz crossed paths in the hallway. Cruz nodded first. "I deserved that," he said. Kennedy gave a slight smile. "We've all been on the receiving end of a lesson, Ted. Best we can do is learn from it." Cruz laughed quietly. "Guess I still need to work on my folksy metaphors." Kennedy chuckled. "Start small. Maybe don't bring a knife to a word fight." They shook hands. And in that handshake, something shifted. Not a friendship maybe, but a recognition. That while they came from different places, different styles, and sometimes different values, they were in the same fight. A fight not for cameras, not for applause, but for something bigger. In the end, that one-liner wasn't just a zinger. It was a mirror. Kennedy's savage retort didn't just leave Cruz speechless, it made him reflect. And maybe that's the lesson here, that humility doesn't always come quietly, and growth doesn't always start with agreement. Sometimes it starts with being called out in front of the whole country and realizing the man across from you wasn't trying to win a game. He was trying to speak truth. So the next time you hear a one-liner from Senator Kennedy or a fiery retort from Senator Cruz, remember behind those words are men with dreams, flaws, fears, and the power to change. And sometimes it takes one savage sentence to remind us all that how we speak matters, but why we speak matters even more.